What if there was a place with all the zip of Nuka-Cola? Wouldn't that be the cheeriest place in all the world? Nuka World is Fallout 4's final DLC, and many believe that it was made because Bethesda wanted to appeal to players who didn't think that Fallout 4 had enough evil options by default. So, this expansion lets players go to an old abandoned theme park to take it over with a group of raiders and become evil. While many players feel mixed about Nuka World as a DLC, I personally have always been a big fan of the new area added by this expansion, and I find myself fascinated by this fictional theme park based around a soft drink. So, this got me thinking, would Nuka World be a place I would want to go to if I was a kid in the pre-war times? Or if I was a parent, would I feel safe taking my kids to the place that literally puts a park with every minimum acceptable safety standard met right there in the jingle? So in this video, I will be looking at what remains of this theme park and try to piece together a picture of what Nuka World would have been like before the war. And thanks to a certain raider overboss, the power is back online, which helps give a better idea of what this place was like when it was up and running. You know, besides all the dead bodies all over the place. And trust me, I found some crazy stuff in this place, so you'll want to stay tuned. First of all, where exactly is Nuka World? How would we get there if we planned a trip? Well, many people online have speculated that Nuka World would be located where Six Flags New England is in real life, and this seems to line up with the Connecticut River flowing through, like how we see a river going through the park from the north in-game. And we see that the monorail comes in from the mountains to the northeast, and then goes all the way to the Nuka World Transit Center back at the Commonwealth. This directionally lines up with maps we can draw in real life. If we assume that we're a pre-war family coming from Boston, we could drive almost 2 hours to get to Nuka World directly, or we could park at the Nuka World Transit Center and then take the monorail there. There are also a lot of buses around this transit center, which we can see around Nuka World as well. So perhaps busing is another means of transportation to get there besides the monorail. Or the buses simply serve to drop people off at the transit center, possibly even from out of state. The monorail runs between the Commonwealth and Nuka World every 15 minutes, so this thing must be a very high-speed train. On Sundays through Thursdays each week, the Nuka Express would run from 9:45 a.m. through 11:55 p.m. and then close at midnight, with early morning rides for the employees. But if we chose to visit the park on a Friday or Saturday, which were likely the busiest days, we can get up early to hop on the first train at 8:45. This will get us to the park by 9 o'clock. Taking the Nuka Express allows for a great first view of the park, as a voiceover describes the attractions offered. At the end of the line, we arrive at Nuka Station, and there would have been shops and walkways here before the war that led guests to the front gate. But there are also several parking lots for those who chose to drive to Nuka World, and it looks like the buses made stops around each of the parks, so if we get tired at the end of our visit, we won't have to worry about walking all the way back to the transit center. One of the first things you'll notice in post-war Nuka World is how arid the landscape looks, and if these pre-war maps are to be believed, then this wasn't always the case. Now, the Commonwealth doesn't exactly have green grass either, but the area surrounding Nuka World looks almost like a desert. But I think this could be due to a few different factors. First of all, the grounds were likely well kept by park staff before the war, and they just, haven't been around for 20 years, but I think there's more going on here than just the lack of maintenance. Following the river north, we find an inoperable dam that was likely a source of power for the nearby town of Brabberton. This was built for the park staff to live in and reduce traffic to the park. The river is still trickling through, but all this water being held back has likely dried out this river valley considerably over the last 2 centuries. The other factor is how it seems that Nuka World was built on purchased farmland. On the outskirts, we can find some old homesteads and remains of farming equipment, so this leads me to believe that John Caleb Bradburton, the inventor and CEO of Nuka-Cola, bought up a bunch of farmland to build his park. Now, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but if any of you took American history classes like me, you may remember learning about the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, where farmlands in the prairies were destroyed by dust storms. These were caused by a mix of drought and poor agricultural practices that destroyed all the topsoil, and then storms kicked all that dry dirt into the air. Now, I couldn't find any concrete evidence in the game that this is what happened to the area around Nuka World, but I think it's a likely explanation as to why the land looks the way it does now. This old farmland wasn't maintained and it dried up, so after centuries of storms, this valley is just barren and arid. Either that or the radioactive soft drink river poisoned the land and made these fever blossoms pop up. But back to the park itself, the first stop on our visit to Nuka World will be Nuka-Town USA, likely a reference to Main Street USA and real-life Disney parks. Nuka World has 6 parks in total, with this one and Kiddie Kingdom being the first parks that opened in 2050. The first thing we see is the main entrance with turnstiles, and these can be found at the entrances for each of the parks. This leads me to believe that each park had its own tickets, so you could choose which parks you wanted to visit. Though I also imagine they sold day passes that would grant you access to all the parks. I'm not sure what the price would be for these, but considering the inflation we see in the Fallout universe before the war, these would not have been cheap. I remember seeing something in-game about turning in old Nuka-Cola bottles to get $15 off the ticket price for the park, but since we don't know the full price, this could be a great deal or barely worth it. But let's assume our family trip to Nuka World will include all of the parks, and we're going to try and see everything in one day, since there's no hotel or lodging anywhere around. So early morning, right when the park opens, we arrive at Nuka-Town USA, and in-game, the first thing we see is Nuka-Town Market, which seems to be a mostly post-war establishment, though there may have been stalls selling merchandise here like a gift shop before the war. To the left we find Bradberton Amphitheater, where the Pack Gang made their base. But this used to be a place where families could come and watch shows with fun characters. We find a few different attractions like this in some of the other parks, and this makes me wonder if they all hosted the same shows, or if they were slightly different at each park. I think this would have been a great place to take really young kids, but the older teenagers may not have been a big fan of this one. But on the other side of the market, we find the Cola Cars Arena, which most Wastelanders will be familiar with as the end of the gauntlet. But in here we find what was clearly a bumper car attraction before the war, a staple of really any amusement park. We find old cash registers behind where the Raiders have built their own structures, and these are built on top of what looks like where the guests would be waiting in line for this ride. Due to the size of this waiting area and the location near the entrance, I imagine this was one of the busiest rides in the whole park, so we may want to avoid the long lines here altogether. Moving on deeper into Nuka-Town, we can find Cappy's Cafe, another spot to buy, you guessed it, Nuka-Cola. But you could also get burgers and fries here, including something called the Spicy Nuka Blast Burger, so this would be a great place to fuel up for the day. Another place to keep in mind is the Nuka World Infirmary tucked around the corner here, so if anyone gets hurt while we're at the park, we can come back here for medical attention. And judging by the holotape we find here left by one of the paramedics, there's a good chance we may need it. I won't play the whole holotape, but to summarize, he reported that as of summer 2077, he had treated over 250 injuries ranging from minor cuts and bruises to broken bones and major injuries, all caused by ride malfunctions. He also mentions that 2 guests died at the park, though he doesn't detail how these happened. This paramedic blames Project Cobalt, the secret military contract diverting funds from park maintenance, but this likely was not public information. So considering all these injuries, the jingle saying, "A park with every minimum acceptable safety standard met," may be more of a warning than anything. Bradberton's office is on the other side of this plaza, and this is presumably where the creator of Nuka World would have been working, though his attention in the months before the war was likely more focused on his secret pet project. There's an infamous quest here to find all of the hidden cappies with these silly glasses, and presumably guests who completed this would have gotten the chance to meet Bradberton himself. But I think this is more for the Nuka-Cola superfans and not the average guest, so we'll leave this one to people like Sierra. But also here is the Parlor, and this is where the best Raider gang makes their base. This was a fancy restaurant where guests were treated to dinner and a show, and this was apparently so popular that tickets sold out months in advance. So if our family wanted to visit, then we would likely have to plan way ahead of time. Moving on, we can stop by the Nuka-Cade to play some games. You pay to get some coins, and then you play the games to get the tickets, and you turn them in at this terminal. Then you watch as your prize is dispensed from Cappy's mouth. This might just be me, but I always prefer to do the arcade games last at the theme park, so that I'm not carrying around whatever prize I win all day, and then I can just have it with me for the ride back. So for our family trip, we can hit this spot on the way out, but I think this is definitely an attraction for all ages. But the last and most notable location in Nuka-Town is Fizz Top Mountain, with the Fizz Top Grill built into it. This was apparently a 5-star restaurant and the fanciest place to eat in all of Nuka World. Even more than the Parlor, I guess. So I don't know, maybe that place is only a 4-star. The view from up here is great, and I imagine it would have been even better before the war. But that's all for Nuka-Town USA, and we can now move on to the other parks, starting with Kiddie Kingdom, since it opened alongside Nuka-Town when Nuka World first opened in 2050. This was obviously a park aimed at younger children with smaller rides and other activities the older kids would probably scoff at. But there is a big Ferris wheel here, and unless you're afraid of heights, I think everyone can enjoy a Ferris wheel ride. There's several other rides here, like teacups, a carousel, and a bunch of other rides where you can sit in a thing that goes around in a circle. But if that makes you too dizzy, then you can make it worse by going through the funhouse, or taking a ride in these cars that seem to be going way too fast. But the one thing that always confused me is these sprayers. When any Wastelander visits the park, the ghoul inhabitants spray irradiated water to deter intruders, and they're really annoying. But this made me wonder, what was the point of these before the war? My first thought was that these sprayed Nuka-Cola because there's a guy in Nuka-Town who says, there's machines here that used to spray kids with Nuka-Cola. I always thought that he was referring to these sprayers in Kiddie Kingdom, but after looking into it a bit more, I think he's likely referring to the Mr. Frothy robots who spray Nuka-Cola out of these fan things. But I'll talk more about them when we get to the Galactic Zone. So I'm just going to assume that these sprayed water to cool down guests during the hot summer months, but I do find it odd we only find them in Kiddie Kingdom. This could be a reference to the smellitizers at Disney World, which apparently spray nice smells throughout the park to enhance the guest experience. Or if we want to go full on tinfoil hat with this could be referencing the conspiracy theory that the sprayers at Disney World pump out happy gas on the guests. But I'm sure Nuka World wouldn't do anything like that, right? But looking at the source of the sprayers, it's in the employee tunnels, which since the war have filled with a glowing radioactive water. But where did this come from? Well, if we follow this pipe, we realize that this was the outflow pipe for the water cooling system of the nuclear reactor in the secret Project Cobalt lab. Now, before we jump to conclusions and assume that Nuka World sprayed guests with nuclear wastewater, we have to realize that this nuclear reactor broke down sometime after the bombs and began leaking radiation into the lab and into this water. But even when it was operational, it still could have been irradiating the water, though it depends on what kind of reactor it is. Without getting too much into all the science, there are two types of nuclear reactors when it comes to water usage. In a boiling water reactor, the water comes directly in contact with the nuclear fuel rods and becomes radioactive. In a pressurized water reactor, the water for cooling does not come in contact with the fuel and is free of radioactivity. All this to say, I assume that Nuka World was not spraying guests with radioactive water, but it is entirely possible. But if we were visiting the park, we would have no way of knowing unless we walked around the park with a Geiger counter. These sprayers turned all the old park workers into ghouls, but they're covered in paint, which is from old clown makeup, so we can imagine that before the war these employees would dress up in makeup and entertain the guests. So if anyone has a fear of clowns, then this would be a good place to avoid entirely. The main attraction at Kiddie Kingdom is King Cola's Castle, where kids were treated to a magic show hosted by Oswald the Outrageous. This guy is pretty annoying when you meet him in game, which makes me doubtful that his show would be any good, but I don't know, maybe the kids would get a kick out of it. And that's pretty much it for Kiddie Kingdom. It seems like the amount of fun you'll have here is dependent on whether or not you are a young child or not, so at best you get a minor injury in one of the rides, and at worst you get radiation poisoning. So I guess not that much changed post-war. The next stop on our tour is the World of Refreshment, which is a big ride that would take guests on a tour of a real operating Nuka-Cola bottling plant. You essentially sit on a boat and ride down a river of Nuka-Cola Quantum while learning about the history of the company, and then at the end you get a glimpse of a working bottling plant. Now, the main thing of note here is that river of Quantum. If we drink it in-game, it's simply labeled as water, but it is very irradiated. A loading screen claims that before the drink was fully released to the public, the water in the river was tinted blue to promote the drink. So this could be the case, since it seems wasteful to manufacture hundreds of gallons of a new product and use it for this. But on the other hand, these Mirelurks turned into Nuka-Lurks somehow, but that could have been from the big glowy quantum machine and not the river. To further confuse this point, there is a terminal entry that shows management was telling the actors working here that they could just drink straight out of the river for an energy boost. And yes, that does sound extremely unsanitary, but they also claimed that quantum is so full of energy that it apparently kills all bacteria it touches. That probably has more to do with the fact that it contains a radioactive isotope that makes it glow, but whatever. Regardless of whether or not this is actually quantum in the river, Nuka World management sucks for telling their employees this. I do wonder if the guests would try to take a drink though. Like, do you think anyone fell off the boat trying to take a sip? Then they would get all wet and sticky from all the sugar. This is assuming that it's actually soda in the river, but also, there's no way this river would stay carbonated, so it would have no fizz and just be completely flat as soon as it was filled. The idea of a quantum river is just a logistical nightmare on so many levels. Also, again to reiterate, this stuff is radioactive. But whatever, would this actually be a fun attraction to visit? Well, if your family wants to learn about the history of Nuka-Cola or see the bottling plant from afar, then this is a great opportunity to do that. But other than that, you get to see a cool power armor on display, so that's cool I guess. I imagine it would have been air conditioned in here, so honestly this might just be a nice place to escape the heat during your time at the park. But if I was a kid, I think I would be super bored here and rather visit one of the other parks. Speaking of which, it's now time to move on to Safari Adventure, Nuka World's own zoo. This one is the park that seems to have the least to do with Nuka-Cola, so much so that it could almost be its own separate thing. But honestly, since everything else in our trip has been non-stop Nuka-Cola, it would be nice to have a change of pace. This place sucks post-war because it's filled with genetically engineered gator monsters, but before the war we can safely assume that there would have been a variety of animals here, like gorillas, reptiles, bears, and probably some other animals too. I don't know, these are just the ones that you can find exhibits for. The first place guests would have been directed to is the Welcome Center, which served to guide guests around the park, but also had a secret cloning lab underneath. Now, the average parkgoer would likely be oblivious to this fact, but only up until they noticed the protesters from a local animal rights group who regularly bothered guests and park staff with their protests of the treatment of animals at the park. They would enter the Welcome Center, spray paint the door, and demand that the animals be freed. They even went as far as to hold one of the lead scientists hostage on the day the bombs fell. Now, I'm not here to say if these activists were right or wrong, but they certainly would have had an effect on our park visit as guests. But if we do our best to just avoid them, then I think we'll be alright. As for attractions beside the animal exhibits, there's another amphitheater here called the Jungle Journey Theater, which presumably had jungle-themed shows for guests to watch. Or maybe they just played the same shows as the Nuka-Town. There's also Cappy's Treehouse. Guests would need to navigate a hedge maze to find the elevator that takes you up to the top, and then you get a great view from up here. We also see an unfinished ride, the Angry Anaconda. This looks like it would have been the largest roller coaster in Nuka World upon completion, but the Great War prevented that. So our family visiting could have said, "Wow, that looks really cool. I can't wait to come back and ride it when it's finished." So your enjoyment of safari adventure would really depend on how much you want to see animals in small cages, and what your tolerance level is for screaming protesters. But moving on to Rock Gulch, and here we get to experience the American spirit of the Old West, and try Nuka-Cola's attempt at direct competition with Sunset Sarsaparilla. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if this entire park exists solely for that reason. Nuka Corp was bloodthirsty when it came to competitors. But Nuka-Cola Wild isn't the only attraction at this park. Far from it. Besides looking like an Old West movie filled with cowboy actors to boot, this park offered plenty of cowboy-themed activities, and most notably, Mad Mulligan's minecart coaster. The robot staff members act like cowboys, presumably for the kids, but also for anyone who wanders by. However, it seems like guests would need to play each of their games to get the key to the mine, which seems like a really odd way to operate a ride at a theme park. Like, did every guest have to do these 3 games to even get a chance to go in and buy a ticket? Or did just one person have to do it each day and then that unlocked the door? Maybe guests could work together, but then I imagine the ride would be unlocked pretty quickly, so what's even the point of locking it? But also for these games, are they supposed to be for one guest at a time? Like, I can imagine several kids working together to find all the missing Giddy Up Buttercup toys, or serving drinks at the saloon, but then we get to the shootout where the Protectron gives you a real working .44 caliber revolver to do a showdown in the street. Now, this is fun for the sake of it being a video game, but I take this to mean that in the pre-war times, the robot staff at this park were just handing out revolvers to kids, and letting them shoot it. And if that's not the most gosh darn American thing I've ever seen, then I don't know what is. But seriously, this isn't even on a range. Like, there would have been people walking all over this place. So, would you just have to watch out for stray bullets every time some kid tries this? And if you're not fast enough, the Protectron shoots a laser blast, which doesn't do that much damage, but still, I imagine a lot of kids went crying back to their parents with burns. Also, even crazier, the Protectron doesn't ask for the gun back. So, was Nuka World just giving kids revolvers on like a daily basis, hundreds of these every day? This one tiny interaction with a robot leaves me with so many questions. But after all these activities, we get the code to the safe for the minecart ride, which looks pretty cool, honestly. This guy enjoyed it so much his hands are still reaching for this guy. But the line to get to the coaster inside is also pretty long, so I guess even after you do all the challenges, you still need to wait in line for this coaster. And this ride is specifically mentioned in the paramedics report as causing many injuries, so that's great. But after this, the only other major thing of note here is the Rock Gulch Theater, which looks very similar to the other ones we've already seen here at Nuka World, but I imagine these shows were more Western themed. There's also a bunch of stands for carnival games and Nuka mixer stations, but those have all been present at the other parks for the most part. So all in all, I'm not impressed with Rock Gulch. It seems like it could be fun for the Western vibes, but the confusion around the attractions and the potential risks involved means I don't think I would feel safe as a parent taking my kids here. But this brings us to the final park, the Galactic Zone. This park is the newest, opened in 2072, and has a more futuristic theme to give guests a glimpse of what the future may hold. Unfortunately, that future never came, what with the nuclear war and all, but still, this park boasts a large number of attractions and a host of unique robots. First up we have the Mr. Frothy. This is that robot I mentioned earlier that sprays Nuka-Cola, but it seems that its tanks of pop have become irradiated over time. But even besides that, the sheer force that it shoots this at you is enough to cause damage. We find medical reports of guests with skin irritation from the acidity of the drink, so add that to the list of health and safety concerns here. So I imagine that guests before the war would be shot with cola by these robots, and then they'd get their clothes all sticky, so I don't see what the point of this robot is. It's just wasting a drink that could be sold. Then there's the Nuka-Tron, which is essentially a walking Nuka-Cola vending machine. But instead of dispensing a bottle of Nuka-Cola, it has these nozzles to fill up your glass, which it would have presumably done after taking some coins. But because of the secret government contract, this thing can also shoot weaponized cola, because why not, honestly? And then there are also these iBots that fly around and play the Nuka World theme song to make sure that you're definitely sick of it by this point in your visit. As for attractions here, there are a few that are just copy-pasted from Kiddie Kingdom, as well as some more carnival games. But this park does hold some of the most unique attractions, starting with the ArcJet G-Force. This was presumably made by the ArcJet Rocket Building Corporation we find back in the Commonwealth. But this ride is one of those things where you strap in and then the ride goes up and down until you throw up. So a great option for thrill seekers, but not great for those who have a weak stomach. The centerpiece of the Galactic Zone is Starport Nuka, which is this big Space Needle looking building. This is where the Quantum Exo-1 is on display, and I've already questioned the logic of this being here in a different video, but for the sake of this analysis, I'll just say that this would have been really cool to see as a guest in the park. On the second floor, there's a bit of a museum display of some military equipment and other technology, which fits with the theme of this park. This is also where we can take an elevator up to the top and get a great view of Nuka World. Another notable attraction is the Starlight Interstellar Theater, which has the same branding as some of the drive-ins we find throughout the wasteland. Guests could sit in these spaceships and watch a movie while the robot staff brought concessions. Though, curiously, their bartender is a sentry bot, and I question how effective it would have been at serving drinks. Like, this thing has lasers for hands, how is it gonna pour a drink? But for the novelty of it all, this seems like it would be a pretty cool place to watch a movie. Though that's usually not one of my top priorities of things to do at a theme park. For a more unique experience, the Robco Battle Zone treated guests to a show where advanced robot prototypes would fight. But according to some records we find here, guests were disappointed to find that these were essentially just existing robots with minor cosmetic modifications. Now, maybe this is just me, but I'd be perfectly satisfied seeing an Assaultron in action, regardless of what coat of paint it's wearing. Honestly, the park staff are gonna have a hard time trying to stop me when they, from going backstage to find one of these bots and... Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Anyway, I think this would be a pretty cool attraction, and if this glass could survive 200 years of war, then I think it would have been pretty safe, so our family's not going to have to worry about lasers or metal parts flying towards us. After this, there are some more minor attractions that I'll briefly mention, like Spacewalk, which is just a hallway that is painted purple with stars. Very exciting. Or Splashdown, which was some sort of fountain? I don't imagine people were using this as a pool, it looks far too shallow, so maybe it was more of a splash pad? I don't know what the point of this is. And there's also the Handy Whirl, which is this big Mr. Handy ride that General Atomics must have sponsored. But the most sinister attraction is Vault-Tec Among the Stars. What appeared to guests as just an exhibit where Vault-Tec would show off their plans to build vaults as bases for space exploration was actually a cover to run experiments, because of course it was. But our experience as park guests would be this. We'd walk through the exhibit, learn about these space vaults, and occasionally feel a bit funny as we unknowingly are bombarded with radiation, or toxins, or subliminal messages. Then, as we're making our way out, feeling a bit woozy, the salespeople will try to get us to buy a spot in a vault. So honestly, this seems like the type of attraction I would go to once and then never again. Hopefully nothing we're exposed to causes any lasting damage. But I saved the best for last here, and that is Nuka Galaxy, a large indoor roller coaster that is still operable even after 200 years. Essentially, guests get to board a spaceship and fly alongside Nuka Girl to stop an alien invasion. In case you forgot, she's that hot pinup girl from the ads. Your guess is as good as mine as to what a blonde in a skimpy spacesuit has to do with cola, but you can't tell me that she's not iconic. As we fly along, we get to see a space colony, and then these robots shoot at aliens, and it's really cool. Then the alien fleet flies away, and we arrive back at the station. Though I should mention that there is a concern that any of these lasers could misfire and hit one of the guests as they fly, but it's probably fine, and honestly, this looks like one of the safest rides we've seen today. But that is really the last stop on our trip to Nuka World. From here we can return to wherever we parked or get back on the monorail to go home. In the end, hopefully we can leave with some souvenirs, good memories, and no lasting injuries. Though there's a good chance we'll be on a sugar rush for a few days with all the cola and snacks from this place. From what I can tell, it seems like you would be hard-pressed to see everything in Nuka World in one day. So if you were to take a trip there, you'd have to plan for what you want to see and where you want to go, but that can be said for really any theme park. Most of your time will be spent waiting in lines and trying to find your way around, but hopefully you can actually get some enjoyment out of it too. There are some other smaller things to see in the area, likely businesses trying to capitalize on the large amount of traffic coming into the region, including a haunted mansion, a giant fire hydrant, and a shovel museum to name a few. These are the kind of tourist traps that are pretty common across America, especially near big destinations like theme parks. I think it makes sense that these places would be here, and they could be a fun thing to see before or after our trip to Nuka World, if not a little disappointing. Overall, the Fallout games have a cynical yet comedic description of what times before the war were like that we can gather based on the evidence we find in the ruins of the old world. But I do think it's fun to speculate and imagine what this retro-futurist theme park based around a partially radioactive soft drink would actually be like. Nuka World obviously isn't real, but I personally think that it would be a place that I would want to visit if it was. I'm not a big fan of soft drinks in general, but I still think that this park has a lot to offer that really anyone could find something to enjoy here. But being honest, it would probably be super overpriced like every other theme park. But let me know what you all think. Would you visit Nuka World if you had the chance? Or were there any details I missed? Let me know in the comments below. So thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video. A ton of work went into this, so I would really appreciate it if you would give it a like, and consider subscribing if you made it here to the end. Alright, I will see you all in the future. Yeah, let me know if you want to see more like this. Okay, thanks, bye.